The silence of the plains was a language Ilara had learned to speak fluently. It was a vocabulary of wind sighing through brittle grass, the distant cry of a hawk painting circles on an endless blue canvas, and the slow, rhythmic creak of the porch swing where her husband, Daniel, had once Saturday. For 5 years, this silence had been her only companion, a shroud she had wrapped around herself after the world had taken everything else. Her homestead was less a home and more a monument to absence, a single, defiant structure against an unforgiving horizon. The fence was mended, the well was deep, and her solitude was absolute. It was a life pared down to the bone, a stable, bleak existence she had chosen as a shield against the jagged edges of memory. But on a Tuesday scorched by the late summer sun, the silence was broken. It was not the howl of a coyote or the rumble of a distant storm, but a sound so human it felt like a violation, a ragged, desperate gasp. She saw him at the fence line, a boy collapsed in the dust, no older than 10. He was Comanche, his dark hair matted with sweat and dirt, his deerskin leggings torn. And protruding from the thin muscle of his back, just below the shoulder blade, was the splintered shaft of a spear. It was a sight of such brutal, immediate crisis that it bypassed thought and struck directly at the dormant heart of her. Every instinct screamed at her to turn away, to bolt the door and pretend she had seen nothing. To help him was to invite the violence that had thrown him here onto her land, into her sanctuary. Who had done this? A rival tribe? Settlers? Men who would not stop until their quarry was finished. The questions coiled in her gut like rattlesnakes. Bringing him in meant bringing the storm with him. It meant forfeiting the hard-won, sterile peace she had cultivated. And yet, to leave him there was an act of cruelty her soul could not bear. He was just a child, his small frame shuddering with each pained breath. In his face, she saw the ghost of another child, a face with Daniel's eyes and her smile, a memory she had tried to bury under years of hard labor and willed emptiness. What is one more ghost? The wind seemed to whisper. But this one was still breathing. Her body moved before her mind could mount another protest. The rifle she grabbed was for protection, but her steps toward him were driven by something else, something she had thought long dead, empathy. She knelt in the dirt, the heat of the ground pressing through the fabric of her dress. The boy's eyes, wide with terror and pain, flickered open. They were dark, deep pools of suffering. He tried to scramble away, a wounded animal fearing the final blow. "Shush," she murmured, the sound rusty in her own ears. "I won't hurt you. I want to help." The words were a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. He didn't understand her language, but he understood the tone. The fight went out of him, and he slumped back into the dust. The world seemed to shrink to this single, terrible point of decision. Behind her was the cabin, a fortress of grief. Before her was a dying child, a magnet for the very same brutality that had hollowed out her world. In that moment, Ilara made a choice. It was not a choice for peace or for safety, but for the flickering ember of humanity that still glowed within her. She would not let it be extinguished by fear. Carefully, she slid her arms beneath him, her muscles straining with the unexpected weight. As she lifted him, his head lolled against her shoulder, a gesture of complete, desperate trust that was more terrifying than any threat. She carried him across the threshold of her home, the dust from his body marking the clean-swept floorboards, and the silence of 5 years shattered into 1,000 pieces. The first night descended like a judgment, draping the prairie in an unnerving darkness pricked by 1,000,000 indifferent stars. Inside the small cabin, the air was thick with the scent of herbs and the metallic tang of blood. Ilara worked by the flickering light of a single lantern, its glow casting long, dancing shadows that made the room feel both smaller and more menacing. The boy, Carve, lay unconscious on her bed, his breathing shallow and quick. The spearhead was lodged deep, a cruel fang of sharpened stone buried in his flesh. To leave it meant infection and a slow, agonizing death. To remove it risked a fatal bleed. Her hands, usually so steady when mending a fence or aiming a rifle, trembled as she sterilized Daniel's old hunting knife in the fire. She had to break the shaft first, a horrifying necessity that made her stomach churn. With a sharp crack, the wood splintered, and the boy cried out in his sleep, a thin, wounded sound that tore at her. Forcing down a wave of nausea, she began the painstaking work of cutting him open. Every slice of the blade felt like a desecration, a violation she had to commit in the name of healing. The world outside mirrored the turmoil within. A storm was gathering on the horizon, its distant thunder a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Then she saw it. Through the small window pane, far across the rolling plains, a single torch flared to life. Then another. And another. A line of moving fire, a hunting party sweeping the land, methodical and relentless. They were coming. The abstract fear of the afternoon had solidified into a tangible, approaching threat. A cold dread washed over her, chilling her to the bone. She was no longer just a healer, she was a guardian, and her small, isolated cabin had become a besieged fortress. She finished her work in a feverish haste, packing the cleaned wound with yarrow and binding it tight with clean linen. She sat by the bedside, her rifle across her lap, watching the boy and the window, her senses stretched to a breaking point. Sometime before dawn, he woke. His eyes flew open, wide with panic, and he tried to sit up, a gasp of pain catching in his throat. Ilara placed a gentle hand on his uninjured shoulder. "Easy," she whispered. "You're safe." He stared at her, his fear slowly giving way to a dawning, bewildered awareness. He was alive. He touched the bandage on his back, his brow furrowed in confusion. He began to speak in a rush of soft, flowing words she couldn't understand, but the desperation in his voice needed no translation. He pointed toward the window, toward the now vanished torches, his hand shaking. He mined a man, a big man, his expression contorting into a mask of pure terror. Then, he reached into the tattered remnants of his breechcloth and pulled out a small object, pressing it into her hand. It was a wooden bird, exquisitely carved from a piece of dark, polished wood, its wings swept back as if in mid-flight. Its tiny eyes were inlaid with chips of turquoise. It was not a toy, it was a treasure, a totem. He was trying to tell her something, to explain that he was not just a random victim of prairie violence. He was running from a specific monster, and this bird was somehow connected to it all. As she held the small, smooth object, a wave of memory, sharp and unwelcome, washed over Ilara. She remembered Daniel, his hands calloused but gentle, carving a small wooden horse for their son, Samuel. He had the same look of intense concentration Carve must have seen on his own father's face. Daniel, the surveyor, the man who believed in maps and fairness, who had always told her that doing the right thing was the only compass a person needed. He had died in a rock slide, they said. An accident. But standing here, with a wounded boy in her bed and hunter's fires on the horizon, the word accident felt thin and hollow, a lie she had told herself to survive. The boy's fear, the mysterious bird, the relentless pursuers, it was all weaving together into a narrative she didn't understand, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that it was a story she was now a part of. The storm finally broke, rain lashing against the cabin, and Ilara did not sleep. She just watched, waiting for the dawn and for the fire to find her. The dawn arrived pale and washed clean by the night's storm, but it brought no peace. They came with the rising sun, a grim procession of 5 riders cresting the gentle slope that overlooked her cabin. They did not ride like lawmen, they rode like owners of the earth, their movements arrogant and assured. At their head was a man whose presence seemed to suck the very air from the morning. He was tall and broad in the saddle, dressed in a fine black coat that was out of place on the rugged plains. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and cold, calculating eyes. He reined in his horse just outside her fence, his men fanning out behind him in a silent, menacing line. Ilara stepped onto the porch, her husband's shotgun held loosely in her hands, its weight a familiar comfort. She had sent Carve to hide in the small root cellar, his eyes wide with a terror that fueled the cold fire in her own veins. "Morning," the man called out, his voice a deceptively smooth baritone. "Name Silas Kane. I own most of what you can see from here." He gestured expansively with a gloved hand. "And I believe you have something that belongs to me." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a stony mask. "The only thing on this land that belongs to me is the land itself, Mr. Kane. And you're on the wrong side of the fence." A flicker of amusement crossed Kane's face. "Feisty. I appreciate that. But let's not waste time. I'm tracking a Comanche whelp. A thief and a murderer. Saw his tracks lead right to your door. Now, you can hand him over, and I'll be on my way. No trouble for you. His smile was a bloodless slash. The words thief and a murderer felt wrong, utterly at odds with the terrified child hidden beneath her floorboards. There's no one here but me, she said, her voice steady. Kane's smile vanished. I've been chasing this boy for 2 days. He stole a valuable horse and killed one of my best men who tried to stop him. He is a savage, and I mean to see him hang. Do not make the mistake of protecting him. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I know what happened to you. Know all about your husband. Daniel, wasn't it? Such a tragedy. A man like that, a good man, would understand justice. He wouldn't shelter a killer. The sound of her husband's name from this man's lips was a physical blow. It was a profane intrusion into the sacred ground of her grief. And then he said the words that changed everything. A real shame. What happened up at Blackstone Ridge? Unstable ground. A man has to be careful where he puts his feet. Blackstone Ridge. The place Daniel and Samuel had died. It wasn't a well-known name, it was a surveyor's landmark on an old map, a map Daniel had been working on. A map that had gone missing after the accident. In that instant, 1,000 disparate pieces clicked into place. The official story had been vague, the sheriff's report cursory. Unstable ground. A tragic accident. But Kane knew the name of the place. Why? How? A cold, horrifying realization washed over her. It wasn't just a rock slide. It was a murder. Her family hadn't been taken by the indifference of nature, they had been taken by the cold calculation of a man. This man. Silas Kane. He wasn't just hunting a Comanche boy. He was a predator, tying up loose ends, burying secrets. And the boy, Carve, must have been a witness. The confrontation was no longer about a stranger's child, it was about her own. The fight was not for a moral principle, it was for a vengeance she never knew she had a right to claim. A new strength, forged in the fires of this sudden, terrible knowledge, surged through her. She raised the shotgun until it was pointing squarely at Silas Kane's chest. You're right about one thing, she said, her voice low and shaking with a controlled fury. My husband was a good man. And he taught me that some things are worth dying for. Now get off my land. The surprise on Kane's face was genuine. He had expected a frightened widow, not a righteous fury. His eyes narrowed, the mask of civility dropping away to reveal the raw malice beneath. You've made a grave mistake, Mrs. Miller, he snarled. I'll be back. And when I am, I will burn this place to the ground with you and that little savage inside it. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men following like specters. Elara stood her ground, the shotgun heavy in her hands, the morning sun on her face. The war had just begun. The silence that followed Kane's departure was heavier and more menacing than any that had come before. It was the calm at the eye of the storm, a borrowed peace on the eve of battle. Elara bolted the door and shuttered the windows, plunging the cabin into a dim, fortress-like twilight. When she opened the trapdoor to the root cellar, Carve looked up at her, his face a small, pale moon in the darkness. He had heard everything, the fear in his eyes now mingled with a sliver of desperate hope. He saw the change in her. She was no longer just a protector, she was a warrior. For the rest of the day, they worked together, an unlikely pair united by a common enemy. She showed him how to load Daniel's spare rifle, his small hand surprisingly deft as he learned to handle the heavy cartridges. He, in turn, showed her things she had never known about the land she had lived on for years. He pressed his ear to the floorboards, teaching her how to distinguish the vibration of a walking horse from a running one. He crumbled dried leaves by the hearth, explaining how their scent on the wind could signal an approach from downwind. They were no longer a white woman and a Comanche boy, they were two survivors, a found family forged in the crucible of imminent danger, their separate worlds bridged by a shared need to live until morning. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and crimson, Carve finally felt safe enough to tell her the whole truth. His words came in a halting mix of his own tongue, broken English he'd picked up from his father, and vivid, heartbreaking gestures. His father, a man named Tarkar, was not a warrior but a scout, working for the very railroad that was carving its iron path across the plains. Tarkar was respected, a man who could read the land like a book. But he had read more than just trails and river crossings. He had discovered Silas Kane's dark enterprise. Kane, who held the government contract to secure the land for the railroad, was using it as a front for a massive, violent land grab. He was driving off settlers, murdering lone prospectors, and massacring small, peaceful bands of natives, blaming each atrocity on the other group to sow chaos while he claimed the blood-soaked land for himself. Carve's father had found the proof, a hidden ledger detailing the transactions and a map marking the graves of Kane's victims. Blackstone Ridge was on that map. Before Tarkar could take his evidence to the fort, Kane and his men cornered him. Carve, hidden in the brush, watched in horror as they murdered his father. In his last moments, Tarkar had pressed the carved bird into his son's hand. "It flies true," he had whispered. "Fly with it." Tell them Carve had run, Kane's men in hot pursuit, the spear of one of the riders finding his back as he fled. The story struck Elara with the force of a physical blow. It was all connected. Her Daniel, the meticulous surveyor, must have stumbled upon the same truth. His maps, his careful measurements, they would have revealed the discrepancies, the hidden graves. His accident was Kane's brutal way of silencing him. The grief she had carried for 5 years, a passive, sorrowful weight, now hardened into a white-hot, purposeful rage. This wasn't just about protecting Carve anymore. It was about honoring the dead. It was about justice for Tarkar, for Daniel, for her Samuel. The wooden bird Carve had given her felt heavy in her pocket, a sacred trust passed from one victim to the next. Her personal tragedy was not an isolated act of fate, it was a single, bloody chapter in Silas Kane's book of atrocities. As darkness fell completely, they saw the torches again, not distant this time, but close, encircling the cabin like a ring of fire. A voice boomed through the night, Kane's voice. "It's over, Mrs. Miller. Give me the boy. He's the last witness. Give him to me, and I'll let you walk away." The lie was so blatant it was almost laughable. She looked at Carve, who was holding the rifle with a grim determination that belied his age. She was not walking away. She was making her stand. "He thinks we are the prey," she whispered, more to herself than to the boy. "He is wrong." The first gunshot shattered the night, splintering the wood of the cabin door. The siege had begun. Fire followed, a torch arcing through the air and landing on the dry roof of the porch. Flames began to lick at the edges of her world, the orange glow illuminating a scene of desperate, hopeless defiance. But in Elara's heart, there was no despair. There was only the cold, clear certainty of a woman with nothing left to lose, and therefore, everything to fight for. The night exploded into a maelstrom of fire and lead. The cabin, once a sanctuary of grief, became a roaring furnace, a death trap lit by the very flames meant to consume it. Bullets ripped through the thin walls, splintering wood and shattering the last of Elara's crockery, each impact a punctuation mark in a symphony of violence. Kane's men were shadows moving in the firelight, their whoops and hollers the sounds of predators closing in. Inside, Elara and Carve moved with a desperate, focused grace. They were outmanned and outgunned, but they had the advantage of righteous fury and a knowledge of their small terrain. Elara returned fire through the windows, her shots measured and precise, not aimed to kill but to suppress, to make them fear the space around the cabin. Carve, positioned at the back window, proved to be a surprisingly steady partner, his small hands reloading the spare rifle as she fired, his eyes wide but his spirit unbroken. But the fire was their true enemy. The roof was catching, smoke pouring into the small room, thick and acrid. They were being cooked alive. It was then that Elara remembered the storm cellar, and a desperate plan, born of fire and memory, took shape. "The cellar," she yelled to Carve over the din. "Go." She laid down a volley of covering fire as the boy scrambled to the trapdoor and disappeared into the earth. The heat was becoming unbearable, the crackle of burning timber growing louder than the gunshots. She took a deep breath of the smoky air, grabbed the last of Daniel's blasting powder, a small keg he'd used for clearing stumps, and followed Carve into the cool, damp darkness below. Above them, the cabin floorboards groaned. They could hear Kane's men, emboldened by the dying gunfire, storming the porch. "She's finished," one of them yelled. Then came Silas Kane's voice, triumphant and cruel. "Burn it! Burn it all to ash!" Ilara worked quickly, her hands sure in the dark. She laid a short fuse from the powder keg to the base of the main support beam directly under the hearth. She looked at Carve, his face illuminated by the faint orange light filtering through the floorboards. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "When I light this, we run. Out the back tunnel. To the creek. Do not stop," he nodded, his trust absolute. She lit the fuse. It sputtered to life, a tiny, defiant snake of fire. They scrambled down the narrow escape tunnel Daniel had dug years ago as a precaution against prairie fires, emerging into the cool night air 30 yards behind the inferno that had been her home. They crouched in the tall grass by the creek bed as the fuse reached its destination. The world erupted. A deafening blast tore the cabin apart from the inside out, sending a plume of fire, splintered wood, and superheated air into the night sky. The men on the porch were thrown like dolls, their triumphant shout silenced forever. In the chaotic, fiery aftermath, only one figure remained standing, silhouetted against the blaze, Silas Kane, stunned and furious. He saw them then, two small figures by the creek. With a roar of pure hatred, he drew his pistol and charged. Ilara pushed Carve behind her and stood to face him, the shotgun held at her hip. This was the final confrontation, not of tactics and fire, but of two pasts colliding. He stopped 10 feet from her, his face a mask of rage in the flickering firelight. "You," he spat. "You stubborn witch. I should have killed you years ago, you tried." Ilara's voice was calm, a chilling counterpoint to the raging inferno behind him. "You killed my husband. You killed my son. You killed Takar." Their names were Daniel and Samuel. "Say their names," the demand threw him. This wasn't about the boy anymore. This was a reckoning. "They were insects," he snarled, raising his pistol. "In the way of progress. Just like you, but she was faster." The shotgun bucked in her hands, its roar echoing across the plains. The blast caught him in the leg, sending him sprawling into the dirt, screaming. She stood over him, not with triumph, but with a profound and weary sorrow. The fire had taken everything, but it had also purified. It had burned away the ghost and left the woman. The sound of approaching horses, real lawmen this time, drawn by the fire and explosion, grew louder. Her war was over. Years later, the land where the cabin had stood was no longer desolate. A new house stood there, larger and more open, its porch facing the rising sun. The fields around it were green and fertile, dotted with cattle and horses. Ilara, her hair now streaked with silver, sat on the porch swing, not in silence, but listening to the sound of children's laughter. Carve, now a tall, strong young man, stood by the fence line, teaching his own son how to carve a small bird from a piece of wood. He had become what his father had dreamed, a bridge between two worlds. Using the ledger they had recovered from Kane's saddlebags and his own testimony, he had not only brought Kane's entire corrupt enterprise crashing down but had gone on to become a skilled negotiator and a respected leader for his people, ensuring the railroad's progress did not mean his people's destruction. Ilara had not returned to her solitude. In saving Carve, she had saved herself. She had found a new family, a new purpose. The ghosts of Daniel and Samuel were not gone, but they were no longer specters of grief. They were warm memories, foundations upon which she had built this new, vibrant life. She had confronted the fire and walked out of the ashes, not unscathed, but remade. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the plains, Carve's son ran to her, pressing the newly carved bird into her hand. It was a perfect echo of the one that had started it all. She looked from the child's hopeful face to the man Carve had become, and she felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost breathtaking. Her simple act of kindness on a scorching afternoon had not just saved one boy's life, it had redeemed a past, reclaimed a future, and proven that even in the harshest of lands, the most resilient thing that can grow is hope.